Hello and welcome to today's SEI webcast, Independent Verification and Validation for Agile Projects. My name is Shane McGraw. I'm the Outreach Team Lead here at the Software Engineering Institute, and I'd like to thank you for attending today. We want to make our webcast as interactive as possible, so you can submit questions in the YouTube chat area now, and we will get to as many as we can. We will also ask a few polling questions within YouTube to get an idea of who's in the audience and how Justin can tailor his talk today. And now I'd like to introduce our featured speaker for today. Justin Smith is a member of the Agile Transformation team here at the SEI. He supports several customers within the U.S. Department of Defense. He coaches leaders and teams through Agile adoption in areas both internal and external to software development, with a special focus on independent verification and validation. Prior to joining the SEI, Justin spent 13 years as a contractor and civil servant for NASA. Justin, thanks for joining me today. Again, thank you for how you handled last week. We were supposed to do this webcast last week, had a couple technical difficulties, but Justin was a very, very kind and cordial. We thank you for that, Justin. Thanks for rescheduling this today, and I'm going to turn it over to you and looking forward to your talk.
Absolutely. Thanks, Shane, and thanks for having me again. And I'm glad we could turn it around so quickly. I was really excited to talk about this. Some of you may have heard me talk at different conferences about these kind of ideas before. And so this talk, I want to try to get in a little more depth of some of these theories that I've mentioned before around IV&V for Agile projects. So as Shane mentioned, I'm with the Agile Transformation team now here at SEI, and I want to tell a brief story before I jump into this. So as he mentioned, I spent time with NASA, multiple parts of NASA, but the majority of it at the NASA IVNV program in Fairmont, West Virginia, which is my home state. And a lot of the concepts you're going to hear today have been matured and thought of at that facility. And so really part of the story, and we'll get into more of the details and how you can read the whole story if you want to in a paper we published. It started when I was with the Irion IV and B team in 2017, and we were working with the SEI. And so we brought a consultant in from the SEI who happens to be my boss now. And we kind of thought through a lot of these challenges, right? A lot of the challenges that people see or face when they are trying to do IV&V for an iterative project or a project that's using some sort of agile framework for their software development. So I just want to give you a little bit of context and my story of how, I found out about SEI and ultimately decided that this would be a fun place to work, right? Because we get to work with various customers and learn from different projects, learn different techniques and research concepts that work in some areas and may not work in others, and share those with our other customers, right? So, one of my main tasks now is to take some of these concepts that were matured and growed at NASA IV&V's facility across multiple projects there, and see how those will work in other contexts. And that's what I'm working a lot with now, my customers within DoD. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about what is IV&V, at just a real high level. Why it's such a challenge for Agile projects, and then these concepts here, the next 4 bullets of adopting an Agile mindset, capability-based assurance, risk-based prioritization, and then adopting an assurance approach or taking on more of an assurance mindset. So some questions that we get asked a lot, I'm going to try to answer just naturally throughout the presentation. As Shane said, please provide all the questions you can, because I think we're going to have some time at the end to get to those. But again, some of the questions that are extremely common are, how can your organization push software assurance activities early in the life cycle? We'll talk about that when we're addressing the adopting an Agile mindset, right? A lot of the concepts that I just mentioned, and we're going to get into more detail, help with bringing those activities earlier up in the life cycle. How does your organization integrate software assurance into the development activities rather than sending it to software assurance group after development, right? So, if you think about a traditional model of IV&V where, you might get all the software when it's done, and then you have time to go review it and provide that feedback back to your customer. Those days are long gone, as we'll kind of get into. So we want to talk about the early integration and how to increase communication sooner. And one thing I wanted to mention before we really dive into this concept, right? I'm saying IV&V a lot, but I'm hopeful that it's more than just IV&V practitioners that are online today. People that might be in development testing, on the project or programs V&V teams, maybe ops testing, or even program or project managers, right, that have to interact with IV&V teams. I hope you all are also on the line and listening to some of these concepts with the work you do in mind, because I think a lot of these concepts can be abstracted and utilized in different ways. So hopefully some of this will make you think, and maybe even provide you a little more insight into how an IV&V team is thinking if you are interacting them within your work. So what is IV&V? I like to think of it as a second set of eyes on the software, and IEEE 1012 does a great job of defining what independent verification and validation is. I think it's Appendix C that highlights the technical, managerial, and financially independent. So technically independent, you don't want the developer or somebody who's developed the software doing IV&V. The managerial independence, just want them in a different management chain. And the financial independent, you want the money that the IV&V team is using to be their own, right? You want them managing their own money as opposed to being a direct funding line from a project, right? You don't want for it to potentially be, cut, or there's some sort of financial threat, or maybe, again, if you go back to the managerial, like a managerial threat heading towards those teams. And again, if you're curious about more details, IEEE 1012 does a great job of laying out different levels of independence, right? Because sometimes you can be really, really independent. They actually use a capital I, and sometimes it's more of a lowercase I, which they also use in that document. So if you've got more thoughts or questions about that, I'd point you in that direction. Does a good job of defining some of that. IV&V can be mandated or chosen. I mentioned I was with NASA IV&V. Most of the IV&V that's done throughout NASA is mandated through the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance. So some of the high-profile missions, I've already mentioned some of the human-rated missions at NASA that I've worked on, like the Orion program, which we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But all of the Artemis programs that NASA has are getting IV&V through the Katherine Johnson IV&V facility there in West Virginia. But it can also be chosen. I actually have a customer right now that I'm working with in DoD that is choosing to do IV&V. And so that is a little bit new of a relationship for me, but it's really fun to see leaders wanting to use that type of risk mitigation, which ultimately, that's what IV&V is, right? It's a risk mitigation approach. You're trying to gain insight into the quality of the software and to get to those issues, get to those risks sooner. That kind of touches on the benefits of IV&V here, these last three slides. One of the benefits, it provides an independent, unbiased perspective. That can't be understated. I mean, especially when you're working with an Agile project, if you think about the values and principles of Agile, which we'll touch on in a minute, they're trying to get useful software, usable software into the customer's hands as soon as possible. Right, they have very strict guidelines of time that they're working on. They have their plans and their increments and sprints they're working on, and so they can be head down. And if you're potentially a program office trying to get insight into that, that might not be the unbiased perspective you're looking for. Right, people have a certain thing they're trying to get done, and I'm not saying that's wrong. I actually think that's a good thing. Right, their eyes are on the prize. Their eyes are on getting that workable, usable software to the customer, because that's what provides value to whoever's putting this project on. The early detection of issues, that's always a go-to with IV&V, right? Finding those issues earlier, getting them addressed sooner is going to be ultimately cheaper at the end of the day. And as we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about some of these Agile principles and getting integrated sooner, you're just getting those issues worked in the backlog. So if you're familiar with a backlog and an Agile software development perspective, that's what we're talking about here, right? Getting those issues identified, getting them in the developer's backlog so they can weigh those with other things they have to work on. And then this last bullet here I'll leave you with is that IV&V improves software quality and enhances safety, right? Ultimately, these things I've mentioned, getting that second set of eyes, getting that unbiased perspective, you're bringing some attention to the decision makers and ultimately whoever have to accept this software into how, what kind of shape the software is in. So how's it performed? Again, driven by IEEE 1012. So just some highlights here of things you may have heard about IV&V if you've worked with them before, if you're providing IV&V services. Some high-level techniques, if you will, document reviews, looking at requirements, design, things of that nature, manual code inspection and analysis, right? Actually getting into the code, looking at how the software is supposed to behave, and then actually executing code, right? Doing independent testing. Sometimes the developer or the program can give you test beds. Other times, IV&V providers will develop their own test beds and truly be an independent test solution. As well as static code analysis. That's another technique that is very common to look at analyze code quickly. All right, so I think we're getting ready to change. Yeah, we're going to switch over to kind of the IV&V and Agile software development. So traditionally, IV&V was built on a waterfall development methodology. So you think about requirements, design, implementation, and test, right? It was very sequential in nature. I think most people were probably familiar with that, even though it's phased out through a lot of programs. Doesn't mean it still doesn't exist. I come across it all the time. So it's definitely still a thing of projects of all sizes, small and large. So what I want to focus on, though, today is Agile development. So an iterative approach, if you're not familiar with that term, right? So doing those things, requirements, design, implementation, test, just iteratively, and those phases happening much more quickly and repeatedly on nature until the software is ultimately accepted. So that provides some sort of, somewhat of a timing challenge for IV&V. And I'm going to take a moment here to just quickly mention a paper that we wrote back in 2017. Actually, I think it was published in 18, but it was about that experience I mentioned with our SEI consultant and the Orion IV&V team at NASA. And so, Shane, I think we have links to those. And so if you could put that in the chat at some point, that would be great. And so folks could check that out. It is truly a story. The paper was submitted to IEEE Aerospace, but it is more of a storytelling that highlights this specific challenge. So I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because I want to get more in the weeds of the concepts in there. But I can mention that, our team was extremely frustrated when the Orion development transitioned from a waterfall method to an Agile methodology. Right. And we found ourselves, very emotional about the decision. And, looking back on it and talking with the team, ultimately it was that stuff's out of an IV&V team's control, right? It's out of a lot of the teams that are probably on this line's control. It's ultimately up to the decision of the program and the developer for what they're comfortable with. And we needed to figure out a way to ultimately get comfortable with that, right? We needed to figure out a way on how we could change to still make an impact and still add value as an IV&V provider to a program that wanted to use an Agile approach. And again, a lot more details in that paper as to how that all went down. So it's actually, I still like reading it to this day because it reminds me just crazy time in my professional career and some of the just challenges we faced and as a team going through it. I'll always look back on that team as one of the greatest experiences of my career because it was just so much fun. As challenging as it was, there were so many highs and lows, and getting to know all those people in the Orion IV&V team was such a blessing for me. So check that paper out if you want to know more about that story. But this last bullet here is kind of driving home the point of what I just said with the value. The importance of being in phase is something we learned very quickly, that if you want to provide value, you have to be able to get that feedback and those issues to the developer, to the program in an appropriate, timely fashion, right? You can't be months out of phase because that could be, several increments of planning behind the developer. So I make this statement about feedback timing is important as feedback content. And what I mean by that is, say you have, you found this very severe issue, right? But months after the final build was delivered, and the program office may have already had to accept it for whatever reason, right? They may have to field the capability or release this mission, depending on how big the project was. because you didn't get it to them soon enough, they are going to probably have to accept that risk until the first update can be completed. So if you can get in phase and look at those high risk areas sooner and get them that feedback quicker, then that's when it can be, looped into the project's backlog, become more in phase, and IV&V still making an impact. So we're getting ready to switch over to this, what can you do to adopt? I want to check, Shane, do we have any questions? I know I've covered a lot of ground here in the first few minutes.
Yeah, just real quick, we launched a couple polls, Justin, as we mentioned in the intro. Just to recap real quickly for your knowledge, 33% independent verification and validation is what best describes what your team does. 26% developer testing, 26% operational testing, and 13% V&V testing on the customer side.
Awesome.
And then the second poll we launched was just asking about if they're struggling to adopt the software development approach, and 62% are, 24% no, 14% so they figured it out. So the only question I had from this section, Justin, was just what are some of the signs that you saw on your IV&V team that led you to know a change was necessary?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for us was our team was like running into a wall. So to give you a little more context about where we were, with the Orion mission, there was a series of test flights, right? And we're going to talk about Artemis more here in a couple slides, but we're almost 2 years to the day of when that test mission flew. But before Artemis 1, there was an exploration flight test where they launched an Orion capsule and a Delta Heavy, I believe, in December of 2016. And that development up to then had been mostly a waterfall methodology, right? We were able to do IV&V within the NASA IV&V team the way it had always been done. Our processes and procedures, the team was able to function pretty smoothly. When that transition occurred, that's when we really started to notice that, when we were looking at documentation, things, we would be able to, we would look at documentation like normal, provide our normal comments, and we would get some comments back from either the program or the developer like, well, yeah, that's not happening until blah, blah, blah release, right? That's not happening until 2 years from now, or yeah, that's going to be updated later. We were just very confused, right? It was a lot of just a lack of understanding of what the Agile framework they were using was and Agile processes in general. And so we really had to take an educational approach for ourselves. That's how we, like I said, got involved with SCI, taking Agile and Government, Safe in Government, I think was the original class we took, and how we met our consultant and my boss now, Will Hayes, who came in and worked a little bit closer. But Shane, was really that emotional reaction of the team, right? That, that human element of like, I want to do good. I want to help here, but I don't know what to do. I don't know how to best do what we do in this environment, right? So it's just a lot of frustration that was mounting, and that's ultimately we couldn't even really put our finger on it other than Agile's bad. That was where we would go to, right? This is not a good idea. We should never be doing this for human-rated software like the Orion. That's where we turned, right? And I remember having conversations with Will about this sort of thing. I'm about ready to tell you all why you should adopt an Agile mindset. I looked at Will and told him, why should I not fire you? Like, that's the whole reason we're in this mess. It's because of Agile. Why in the world would I want to do it? And here I am now preaching this message. So
great insight. Thank you for that, Justin. And just the last thing for me is we have the link to the Orion paper in the chat now. So
thanks, Shane. Appreciate it. So again, as I just kind of mentioned there, one of the things your team can do to adapt for Agile is to get in phase with that development while maintaining independence, right? You can become more collaborative depending on the rules you have in place. I know there are certain instances within DoD where it's a very strong capital I independent. But again, there are ways to work with the developer, to work, with the program office president or whoever your customer is, and to make sure you are remaining independent. But it's all about that collaboration, increasing the communication. You're not going to be able to wait on those mandated milestones if they even exist, right? A lot of government contracts still have some of those in place, but they're there more just for updates, right? The real work is happening behind the scenes at the developer, because those mandated milestones are probably going to be too late. And we'll talk more about this 10 developers increment planning, but that's one way that you can really increase communication and awareness with the developer, is to get insight into some of their main planning efforts. But the bottom line that I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation highlighting is to adopt an agile mindset as an IVNV team. So what is an agile mindset? A lot of people like to think of agile as a noun. It's a thing, right? My team does agile. We practice safe, or we practice Kanban or extreme programming. I want you to think of it more as an adjective, right? It's a mindset. It is it's a way you think. And if you reference the Agile Manifesto, which is an awesome website, it's like it hasn't changed in 20 years. So I love going there. It reminds me of the early days of the internet. But in there, it describes, Agile is described by 4 values and defined by 12 principles. And then it's manifested in many practices, right? So that's where those practices, those frameworks are starting to come up. That's where you get into scaled Agile framework. That's where you get into Scrum, Kanban, extreme programming, mixtures. What works for you. That's that practice. And I want to make this claim that an Agile IV&V approach is a practice, right? It's not some framework or branded tool. It's a mindset. It's a way you think about IV&V moving forward. So some principles and Agile values and principles that IV&V can adopt that most of my teams have had a lot of success adopting, both teams that I've managed and teams I coach now. And we're going to go into more detail in grouping these in the next few slides, but I just want to hit them at a high level. Backlogs of work, small batch size of work, visualization of work, right? So 3, and again, we're going to group those into the work, increment planning and sprint planning, and then stand-ups and retrospectives. So these are some, and again, if you're familiar with the Agile Manifesto, you can probably see either the values that these are extracted from, or one of those 12 principles that they come from. So what does this look like, right? And I just kind of grouped them together. So the work, which we're going to talk about first, it's right sizing it, putting in a backlog, using a tool to visualize it, whatever that tool may be, right? The planning, doing planning in a regular cadence, using your backlog. I'm going to tell you a little bit how we're trying to reclaim the independence aspect of an IV&V team. We don't want the IV&V team in an agile development setting to be super dependent on the developer. I mean, ultimately, you have to have them, but I'm trying to bring up the point that you need to have a plan going in, right? And then when you mesh your plan with their plan, that's where the magic really seems to happen. Backlog prioritization, it's an ongoing process, right? So if you're doing planning, you're able to continually update what you've learned through your analysis, what you've learned from talking to the developer, what you've learned from talking to the customer. It's just a way to keep on the ball and keep that planning as up to date as possible, which ultimately will allow you to keep your backlog as up to date as possible. And again, we're going to talk more in detail about that section as well. And then we'll close today by really hammering home communication. Key tenet is that increased communication. The stand-ups and retrospectives have been extremely helpful for me. It's been extremely helpful for a lot of the teams. That's one of the biggest pieces of feedback I get back from analysts, as well as the people I work with, is how that increased communication really helps the knowledge sharing effort. And if you think about, IV&V, right? You're hiring software engineers, computer scientists, computer engineers, people that are good at software. They might not be the most extroverted people, right? A lot, sometimes they don't want to communicate, but the value of getting them comfortable with giving their updates in a stand-up or bringing up possible things you could do differently in a retrospectives, that level of comfort that can be built up within the team is huge. And I've seen teams grow so quickly through that, learning from each other, learning from what works, what doesn't work, what techniques can be used. All those lessons learned shared really become lessons learned as opposed to just lessons stored, somebody writing them down somewhere telling them. But when you see that help unfolding through those types of things, it's really, really pretty awesome. So let's dive into the work first. So we just talked about right sizing it and breaking it down. the timing of months of long document and code reviews are gone for most programs. That's just not a thing that you're going to be able to do anymore. And that's one of the things that we were struggling with on the Irion team, that we knew if we were going to make an impact and we were going to be able to deliver some sort of value, we had to get them information quicker. And so we had to figure out, how can we break our document reviews or independent test cases into smaller batch size. I'm going to give you an example of what we ended up using. Arbitrarily breaking things down is not ideal. It is possible. I see people do it. So you can do it by just saying, hey, we're going to break this release down into certain code modules. You can do that. That's fine. But I think where you may struggle is being out of phase, right? You won't be able to keep up with the pace of development to add value unless you have some sort of a plan that you can mesh with their plan and understand when they're going to be working on certain things versus not working on certain things. But again, bottom line, we needed it. And I think this is one of the biggest pieces of decomposing the work into small batch size. You need a new way of looking at the system as a whole, so you can take a proactive mindset. I'll say this several more times, right? That, one of the things that we tried to move from was we didn't want to be so dependent on the developer, because again, we didn't understand Agile as good as we could have, but we wanted to have more of a plan. We wanted to be proactive and understanding what are the riskiest areas that we want to go work on. What do we want to try to do when it makes the most sense? Which we're going to talk about that when we get to the planning approach. But one approach to doing this, it's not the approach, it's not the only approach. The one approach that I've had success with, and I've seen different teams have variable success or success with variabilities of this idea, is to look at the capabilities of the system. So just talked about Orion and Artemis several times. Like I said, this mission was flown almost 2 years ago to the day, Artemis 1. It's not important that you know or see what all is on the board, like these, or what all is on the slide, all these specific capabilities. But I want you to understand that's what those are. That's what those colors are, because that's what we're going to talk about, are these capabilities that made Artemis happen, right? Capabilities that the Space Launch System had to execute, capabilities that the Orion capsule had to execute, capabilities that ultimately needed to be successful for this test mission to be a success. And we're going to actually dive down into one of these to give you some more examples as to how we plan. But again, I told you, this is just a space example. This is a very detailed, long, to give you the elevator pitch, and we'll talk about it more on the next slide or a couple slides. But this is a launch, going to the moon, coming back from the moon, and coming back into Earth, right? There's a lot that had to happen to make this a success. Not all missions are this complicated or this large. And I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys on this phone call or on this webinar probably have mission threads that you may be thinking about now, right? How could I break my mission or my missions into different threads? How could we look at capabilities that are ultimately supporting these missions and breaking the work down in that form or fashion? So now that I got you hopefully thinking in that mindset, the key of looking at that mission as a set of capabilities is going to is going to increase your system understanding tremendously. That's another piece of feedback that I got from the Irion team, as well as a lot of the teams I'm working with now, is taking the time to break down the systems and learn about the systems of those capabilities that make up the systems. It's just going to increase your knowledge so much. And when you get in there and try to look at the code, it's going to give you so much more of the big picture that will help you be such a better analyst, right? So many times analysts come to me like, that exercise, because it does take time, right, to do this when you're setting up your project, but that exercise makes them so much stronger when they get in there and start analyzing the code. So looking at that top level of the capabilities, I kind of already touched on them. Again, we're going to look at one specifically, but they were in total: launch, Earth orbit, translunar, trans-Earth, Earth reentry, and disposal. So those capabilities can then be broken down further, right? You can do analysis at that level, but we find there's more value in doing it at a much smaller level, right? Again, we're trying to get the batch size of work into a small enough batch size of work that can still have value, but be done quickly, right? I'm talking in a matter of days to weeks as opposed to months, which is, again, was very different for us on the Orion team. So we're going to specifically look at Earth reentry. So if I zoom into that picture, that's the blue circles, right? So there are two capabilities that diagram identified that need to happen for mission success. They need to successfully enter Earth's atmosphere, which is the entry interface capability, and they need to successfully splash down, right? So that's a Pacific Ocean landing within view of the US Navy recovery ships, if you can't read that text on the screen. So those two capabilities are made up of other capabilities that need to occur successfully, right? So again, as you're learning what the capabilities are, you're going to quickly realize, well, this is a tree, right? So you've got like the top level capability, and then they start to branch out. And so as you dig a little deeper, we would break those even further down, right? And you would break them down until you reached a point that, okay, this is probably our minimum viable product, right? This is probably the minimum work we could do that would add some value for the developer, for the program, for some sort of risk assessment. And that ultimately would result in a network of work. For IV&V, we refer this to as assurance network. We, on the Artemis team, we built an assurance case. You don't have to build an assurance case, but this leads to something down that line if you like assurance cases and you find value in doing that. But the bottom line is it results in a network of these capabilities, a network of things you can go add assurance for or do analysis for that will provide value to somebody. So our goal was always to add assurance for as many of those capabilities as possible, knowing that because of financial constraints, time constraints, any type of resource constraint, you might not get to everything. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we prioritize that on the next slide. But that breakdown of those capabilities, that ultimately is going to become your backlog to start with. That's ultimately going to become how you're going to prioritize your work. So Shane, do we have any questions before I jump over into that prioritization?
We do have a couple, Justin. One from Sean asking, do you have a recommended priority definition for defects, requirements, design, code bugs, etc.?
So I'm interpreting that question as a prioritization of what order they should be addressed, and if so, I think his name's Sean.
Sean, yeah.
Yeah, Sean, if you could answer Shane, just a quick yes or no, but I'm assuming that's what you meant. Ultimately, what we would do was get them all back to the developer and have them put in the backlog, right? So if you're familiar with how the how most agile or iterative nature teams are doing their work, they're doing it over some level of time using a backlog of all the work they want to get implemented over that time. And so what we would do is we would provide our feedback to them so they could factor those in to their backlog of work. We would find that a lot of times, because they're trying to do working code, they were most interested in the code stuff. Now, if you have a big team, if you have a large development team that has their own V&V provider in-house, they were very interested in the requirements findings, right? Because again, they're trying to start to map out their own test plans, and they're doing their own requirements tracing, and so they would be interested in that. So ultimately, it depends, but our goal was just to get them to the customers as quickly as possible. So hopefully, Sean, that answered your question correctly.
Okay, we haven't heard. Actually, Sean just chimed in now. Yes, it is the defect mission critical MC, but not with a workaround.
Okay.
One more from Fryod in this section, and I know we can't recommend tools, Justin, but he asked, is there a software tool to show us that the requirements are validated and verified at the early design phase?
That varies. A lot of we at IVNV had our own internal tool we created at NASA. I see different teams use tools that usually the developer has. A lot of people might be familiar with Doors. I don't know all the details of how Doors does the requirements tracing. I've never taken like a class in it or something, but I know that I've seen IV&V teams lean on that as well. Might be able to, if you want to follow up with me offline, we might be able to talk more in a little detail about that and get some more in depth around your question. But yeah, I personally don't have any recommendation of tools. A lot of times when we get down to it, though, if you had the resources and time, building your own databases, that helped a lot. I know NASA IV&V has done a great job. They have an internal tool team there that really can meet the needs of the analysts. Because again, it's a large program, right? You're talking 250-ish analysts. And so that the investment in creating tools, databases, things that can help them do their job is a good investment for the government.
Okay, last one for this section. A couple of slides back, Justin, you mentioned the Agile Manifesto, and that was written with software development in mind. How does that apply to verification and validation? If you can get into
Yeah,
that.
great question. That was one of the first things as we were learning with Will Hayes, our SEI consultant, who was teaching us Agile. That was one of our early questions for him, right? Because again, we thought this was the whole reason we got into this problem was because of Agile. And we don't develop software, right? We kept saying that. We're not software development. And so that was in the early phases of SEI working through some of these challenges. And he actually still have the copy he gave me. I use it from time to time with teams. He simply took out working software. So if you were to take all 12 of those principles, he would take out working software and add value. He would just replace it with the word. And he said, and again, we're going to talk about value here at the end of this presentation, but he was really driving home the point. You need to think of this as the mindset of what is your value, right? And so spoiler alert, our value was assurance, right? We viewed assurance as our product as opposed to working software. So we wanted to get assurance, which involved issues, risks, findings, positive statements, which again, I'm going to talk about this more before we close. We wanted to get that to our customers' hands as quickly as possible. So it was just a little bit of a wordsmithing and kind of a mindset shift around those principles. So if I didn't answer your question, please follow up with me and I'll be happy to talk more a little bit about that.
Thanks, Justin. We're caught up for now.
Yeah. So this next bullet here is the IV&V provider. Our goal was to add assurance. That's where that word, what our product was. But again, I want to get into prioritization, right? So we're going to shift from breaking down the work. So hopefully you guys got something out of that, the concept of the capabilities, to prioritizing it. And we used this follow the risk mentality. Real quick, I just used this analogy last week with another group. My project lead, John, was really good at kind of bringing the team together around certain ideas. And around this idea of following the risk, right? We knew based on our financial limitations, resource limitations, we weren't going to be able to get to everything. And so because we had this backlog now, we needed to have some sort of way to score these capabilities for perceived risk. And he always uses the analogy of forest fires, right? So, if you think about how forest fires contain, right? That's a lot of the times the goal of the fire departments and the natural resource groups that are working on these fires is containment, right? They know that fire will go out eventually, but they can't always spend all their time getting those big flames put out, right? They just have to contain it. So if you got big flames over here, you're ready to attack a neighborhood, that's really high risk. You got to focus on that area first, contain it, and then you can go focus on other areas, right? So that was this analogy he used, a visualization that he used all the time to help folks understand this idea of risk with IV&V, knowing that we didn't have the time or any resource to pound these risks flat, right? We had to do our best and try to make sure we got as much as we could, and we had processes to help us keep track of that. But at the end of the day, you had to be comfortable with moving to another risky area and leaving a little bit of smoke burning in certain areas, right? And again, that paper has a good a good visual in there to what that looked like. We actually had a heat map that we used to visually show this risk. And I'm going to show you a small version of that on a couple of slides up. Maybe it's the next slide. But again, diving more into the details here, you need some way to help, provide you insight, some way to help you decide what's more important. We use risk. So it was a way to make something that's traditionally quantitative. We would give it a number. There's multiple ways to do this. I don't think I've ever seen a team outside of the NASA IV&V teams, because they have a consistent process, but every team I work with does it a little bit different, and that's okay as long as you're consistent and your process is documented, right? You just got to be consistent with it. But those risk scores will then help you identify where the greatest perceived area of risk is. Where are your biggest fires burning at that moment based on those capabilities you've identified? And then you can go deploy those resources to perform IV&V in those riskiest areas first. We would look at, depending on the risk level, it would help analysts understand, well, what kind of IV&V should we do here? How much IV&V should we do here? Is this just a little static code analysis, or is this a super risky area that's new for the developer and we've got to really get the microscopes out and inspect this code manually, from beginning to end? All that played into those scores and ultimately what we wanted to do with it. And it's constantly reevaluated, right? Because you're doing planning now, as you're doing analysis, you're learning information along the way, both through your work and through the developer's work and through the program's work. Everything's changing. And so you need to update that as we go. So what does this look like? We used a visualization. Like I said, we used a heat map. It, at the time, had no discernible organization to it. There wasn't like you could look at it and be like, oh, this is this area, this is that area. It just kind of organically grew. I have teams now, though, that do it almost like a weeping willow tree, right? Where you have the very top capability or the project itself, and then it kind of trickles down as you go. And so then you can look at this tree, be like, oh, that's a bad part of the tree, or that's a good part of the tree, right? So these colors, these are totally made up. There's no risk that I'm aware of with any of these capabilities. I just made it up to use the words we used on the capability slide and give them some hypothetical scores. So what this could look like, and again, that paper has a full size, what Artemis would look like, as well as a blog post that I've done that kind of summarizes this concept as well. Has a picture of this with no words in it. But, if you've got Artemis 1 there in the middle, right? So let's say the whole risk profile of Artemis 1, based on all the analysis you've done, is green. It scores out as green per your risk parameters. And then around Artemis 1, see what's touching it are all those 6 capabilities, from reentry all the way to disposal. Well, we looked at reentry, and you'll notice reentry I colored yellow just to kind of drive a point home. So it's a moderately risky, right? It's not a red risk, but it's a moderately risky capability that needs to happen, right? Because if you don't do entry interface right, you're going to bounce off the Earth's atmosphere or maybe burn up if you come in wrong. And splashdown's got to go right too, right? You don't want to destroy the vehicle when it gets in. So those have been scored out to be moderate. But again, just trying to drive a point here home of how you can break this down and roll up assurance, which we'll talk about here when we get into assurance. So looking at splashdown even further, right? If you break that capability down, I just made up some other capabilities that have to happen, right? So maybe there's an altitude check involved to let you know how high you are. And then there's a shoot deploy command, or there's an RCS jet fire that gets the vehicle in the right, the right position before it splashes down. And then there's a capability that uprights the vehicle, right? All these things have to happen. And what I wanted to highlight here is, well, say your analysis found there was, some risk involved. You found some issues with the RCS fire capability, right? When that red risk factors into the shoot deploy and the attitude check, it ultimately resulted in that yellow splashdown risk, which then ultimately rolls up to the splashdown or to the reentry risk, which then ultimately rolls up to the overall Artemis risk. But the way you can utilize this is through communication, right? We found that it's far more powerful to communicate to your customer in terms of capabilities than software modules or code findings, right? You still have all that detail, but you can go and tell a program manager, After, we did some analysis on the RCS fire capability, we think there's risk here. We don't have a ton of confidence in this capability's ability to perform because we found this, this, and this, right? And here are the details on those issues. But you're speaking in terms of that capability. And because of that, there's some splashdown risk, right? And that ultimately will impact reentry, so forth and so on, right? So you're building up this picture of how the program management, program leadership is used to talking, right? They understand these capabilities very clearly. And, sometimes people have a really good understanding of software. Sometimes they don't. And right, what we tried to do was meet them in the middle, right? This was a way we could talk in that language and go very quickly into extreme detail about the software if we had to. So integrating this approach earlier in the life cycle, I've touched on a lot of these things throughout, but I just wanted to, again, highlight it a little bit here. To address that challenge of being out of phase, you have to embrace that independence, right? What we just discussed, breaking down capabilities, coming up with risk assessments, developing your plan helps you go get it, right? It helps you understand what you want to go do. You don't necessarily have to wait on a developer to release a requirements document or this and that. Yes, you need that stuff, but what work can you do with what you have, right? Because if they're using an iterative agile development, you just don't always know what is coming out when, because they're not valuing the documentation over that working product, right? Think back to the Agile Manifesto. So it just ultimately takes some thinking and some, maybe, again, that mindset shift from the IV&V or testing team as to how can we work with what we've got? Knowing that we should be getting more, but we want to build that understanding, we want to build that insight up as much as we can while we're in phase with them. And that's going to require that system understanding, which we've talked a lot about. So the prioritized backlog will also help. Knowing what you want to do is a great start, and things can change as analysis and learning occurs, right? Your plan is going to change. As you do analysis, you're going to realize there wasn't as much riskier as I thought, right? Communicate that, right? Tell people how good the software is. And we'll talk more about this before we close as well in the assurance stuff. But next, is understanding what the developer is doing. I can't understate that enough as to how the communication with the developer or the program, if that's what you have to do, helps you in your planning. Knowing what they're going to work on, knowing what their value is, knowing what they're focused on, ultimately can help you decide what you want to focus on and what you think needs to be planned. Attending those planning events, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to learn about their risks, about their concerns, right? What's preventing them from getting to where they need to be to satisfy their objectives that are laid out in their contract. A lot of great can come to that integration factor of getting tied in to however your developer is doing planning. All right, we're going to switch to assurance approach. Shane, any questions I want to hit on before that?
No, you can wrap up this. We have some questions, but we'll be able to wrap them up at the end, Justin. Thank you.
Sounds good. So again, I've talked about this slide a lot, this assurance approach, this assurance mindset. One of the things that really bothered me early on at IV&V that I couldn't quite figure out is just the negative connotation around IV&V, right? I was like, why does everybody view me as a bad guy? As the project manager, I would have to communicate issues and risks. And that kind of can lead to a bad rap, right? People think of IV&V as auditors, process police, homework checkers, usually the bearer of bad news. Like, nobody was ever happy to see me, which was not a great feeling. We were always being told, oh, we can't fix that. Or, we're again, I'm a positive guy. I like to think with a positive mindset. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. It wasn't always easy switching gears for me and being that bearer of bad news. So I tried to put a positive spin on that. And that, again, is one of the things that I find valuable about assurance being a product is, again, you can tell them when you have high confidence. Like, wow, we looked at all this software related to this capability, and it is awesome. Like, we found a few grammatical things, and we've talked to the developer about some of these requirements findings. There's nothing major wrong with the code that we see. The independent testing is going great. We think this thing is going to be awesome, right? And that's just a very different way of delivering the message. because again, I want to drive home this point of value. Traditionally, IV&V's value has been tied to the number of issues and risks found. But what does that mean, right? If I go into, say my customer's a safety board, and they want to know what I think as the IV&V team of the project. If I go in and tell them, well, I found 1,000 issues and I submitted 6 risks against the program, and we think, that's what we found. But what does that mean, right? They can look right at me and say, so what, right? Unless I give them some sort of assessment of the overall software module or system, what does that mean? Like, did I miss 1,000 issues? Just because I found 1,000, did I find them all? Probably not, right? I mean, nobody's perfect, but you need to start thinking about how can I, again, if you shift to this assurance mindset, you're still giving them the issues and risks, but it's also giving them the full picture of the module, of the capability, of the system, whatever level you want to go to, right? And that's where this assurance can go up and down depending on the work you're doing. And the value of that, I've kind of touched on some of this throughout, but the customer, whoever that is, right? Program office, safety organization, developer, that is going to provide them greater insights sooner. They don't have to wait on milestone reviews, right? That smaller chunk of work can deliver findings quicker to them, right? You can tell them this module worked great. This capability looks really good on a 2-week cycle, as opposed to having to wait 2 years at some critical design review, right? And you have to save all that stuff up. I don't see a ton of value of that in this world we're operating in. So again, the areas of the highest risk, if they're worked earlier in the life cycle, if for whatever reason the system has to be rolled out, the capability's got to go live, you can cut it right there and tell them what the current synopsis of the risk is based on where you've been. Hey, we were able to get to all these high risk areas, so here's your overall risk landscape. Or we still got a lot of risk left. You cut that really early, and I understand why. But here's where your risk lies. You can deliver that with great conviction, as that's your analysis. So, and I've already mentioned the assurance rolling up to the network capabilities through kind of the heat map. But ultimately, someone's going to have to make a final call on acceptance of that software. And so the more insight into areas of risk provided in phase, the easier that decision is going to be for them, right? You're not going to surprise anyone. We always had a no surprise policy at IV&V, and I've kind of taken that and ran with it. There should be no surprises anywhere, right? As along the way, you're giving them these issues, so they should have a pretty good feeling of what you think of the software. And so by the time they need to make a final call on acceptance, you guys aren't going to be far off from where, that discrepancy in knowledge. So that's what I see as the value ultimately to this approach. And so that's my last slide, wrapping up, kind of highlighting some of the things we've talked about and really what I want to drive home for you to think about as we're moving out of here. And really any of these ideas that you may want to talk more to me about, please reach out. And I got my contact information on the next slide, but really think about adopting an agile mindset, right? However that looks for you. And if you've got questions about that, talk to me. Look at mission capabilities or functionality to get that small batch work situated, right? Again, that's a way to do it. Maybe there's requirements. Maybe that's how you want to get your small batch work, whatever it is. Some sort of way to focus on something you can prioritize. I still view as following the risk or looking at a risk-based prioritization as one of the better ways to do things, just because that's our commodity in the federal government, right? We don't, money as being a driver in the commercial world, risk is one of our primary drivers. And so if you can speak in that terminology, if you can plan in that terminology, it can go a long way. Focus on transparency and communication amongst all stakeholders, up, down, side to side. Just be open and honest with what you're seeing, help you need, help you can provide all along the way. Because ultimately, that's going to give your customer more insight earlier, and it's going to help the program, redefine the program's observe, orient, decide, and act loop, the OODA loop. And that can help influence the future rather than correct the past out of phase, which is ultimately what we want to avoid, right? We want to avoid those surprises. We want to avoid those big ticket items that have a huge price tag and just make everybody unhappy. Like nobody likes those. And at the end of the day, IV&V and the developer and the program office and safety boards, we're all on the same page, right? We're all on the same team, ultimately looking for mission success here. So with that, I think we have just a few minutes left for questions. Here's my contact information. Email me if you want to talk about any of this stuff. If we don't get to your question today, I'd be happy to get back with you whenever I can. So again, thank you so much, Shane. I will turn it over to you so you can navigate what time we do or don't have for questions.
Great. Thanks, Justin. Question from Roy. You seem to be focused on large mission critical systems, but what about smaller systems such as unreliable forensic software? Would your approach apply there too? And would you undertake I'm assuming such a project?
Possibly. I don't know anything about that software. So I'd love to talk to you more about what that entails. So I can speak to the first part of the question, the large systems. So we've actually used this approach for Mission Control Center. So that was one of the newest projects we did at NASA IV&V before I left, which is a much smaller, insight-based, think apps, right? Apps on computers that can monitor the vehicle in space. We were using this approach with that, right? We would just look at those capabilities of the applications. So I'm also working with another program I'll call it a middle ground system. But again, and I can't really talk a lot about it, but we've had to break their work down in a very different way, right? So it's very different from what I've been talking about here, but it seems to be the right path for them. Time will tell, but they feel comfortable with where they want to head now. So again, please reach out. I'd love to talk more about what you're looking at specifically.
Just a comment from Lonnie in case it triggers something from you. I sometimes use function points as a measure of value. For IV&V, it's harder to measure value, but reduction in the cost of quality is one of my favorite.
That is a good one. Yep. Value as a government entity, we still had to speak to our value more than we would have liked to. And yeah, that was always a challenge, right? We were always playing around with different levels of value, right? How do you highlight the value associated with IV&V? And now in this world where projects are paying for it a little more, that does become ever so more important to be able to justify the value.
Thomas asks, what testing did the development team do?
I'll assume that means the Orion development team. They did a ton of testing, constantly testing. They were using their own, because again, they had to verify all the requirements for Orion. There were a lot of them. They had built up at least 2 completely full-scale, hardware, software mock-ups that they could do a ton of testing on. So they were doing a lot of testing off the requirements. At NASA IV&V for the Artemis program, again, we have an awesome independent test lab. They built their own Artemis level testing facility. So then they were doing a ton of testing. So we had people, that was their full-time job, just working up independent test cases, right? Dreaming up evil things to do to the software, trying to break it so that we could report back to the customer, hey, you might have a vulnerability here. And that was the same for the cyber team too, right? We had a cyber team doing the exact same stuff. How can we prove to the customer their software has a weakness here, that bad actors can get in there? So yeah, lots of testing.
We're about a minute left, Justin. Just another quick one, maybe. How independent verification validation can help enhance system safety? Anything short and sweet there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think ultimately a second set of eyes goes a long way for that system safety. We, as a human-rated program and project for the Artemis, all those Artemis projects were technically human-rated. We focused on safety requirements, right? So when we looked at all of our work, some of them had asterisks next to them because those are the safety requirements. We really needed to be sure on that. So we could go to the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance and say, we verified and validated the safety requirements 100%, right? There was no missing those. So when we had our risk prioritization, that sort of thing, ultimately that factored in. So hopefully that answered your question there of how you could specifically focus on safety requirements to make sure you address those, which ultimately will drive the overall level of the safety up.
Justin, great discussion today. Really thank you for sharing your expertise with us today.
Absolutely, Shane. Thanks again for having me, and thanks for everybody for dialing in. Again, hopefully I hear from some of you in the future. So thanks, Shane.
Thank you. And as Justin mentioned, we thank you all for attending today. Upon exiting, please hit the like button below and share the archive if you found value. Also, you can subscribe to the SEI's YouTube channel by clicking on the SEI seal in the lower right corner of the video window. Lastly, join us for our next webcast, which will be tomorrow. And our topic will be cyber challenges in healthcare, managing for operational resilience with Matt Bakovic and Daryl Keeling. Registration information is on our website now. Any questions from today's event, please send to info@sei.cmu.edu. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.